Dear colleagues, welcome to the 11th seminar of our seminar series on the social role of colleges across the globe. I first wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we as researchers of the U of T are very grateful to have the opportunity to work on this very land. This seminar series is organized by Professor Lisa Wheelahan, Professor Gavin Moody, and myself with the support of the Center of the Study of Canadian and International Higher Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education at the University of Toronto. Special thanks to the graduate assistants, Si-Young Lee, Erin Anderson, and Ahmed Zhu for their support. This series explores the important role that community colleges and similar type of institutions play in supporting social, education, and cultural development in their local communities and regions. We argue that the role that the colleges play is not as well understood or theorized as the role of universities and schools, and that this matters because colleges are a vital for the well-being of their local communities. They support their regions and communities in many often invisible ways. However, the ways in which they do so it differs in different countries and systems, and that's why this speaker series includes speakers from very different systems. So until now, this speaker series featured great presentations on developments in the college sector in Canada, in France, in Switzerland, in Finland, the United States, Germany, the UK, Chile, Australia, and Brazil. And you can access the presentations and recordings from them on our website, and I posted in the chat right away for you. So for today, we are very happy to continue this series with a talk from our today's speaker, Professor Alan Hazelkorn, with the title Restructuring Irish Post-Secondary Education from the 1970s to 2023. Professor Hazelkorn is joint managing partner at BH Associate Education Consultants, which is a consultants institution, and she's Professor Emeritus from the Technological University in Dublin, Ireland. She's joint editor for the Policy Reviews in Higher Education and member of the Advisory Board and Research Management Committee for the Center for Global Higher Education at the University of Oxford, and research fellow at the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. Professor Hazelkorn is a member of the Quality Board for the Icelandic Higher Education and the EU Higher Education for Smart Specializations Advisory Group, and at the Committee for Strategic Advice for the European Association of Institutions in Higher Education. Please check out her website. You will find a lot more of her work there. We are very pleased, Professor Hazelkorn, that you found time to do this presentation for us for this speaker series. It's the second last presentations of the series, and we are very grateful that you are here with us. Before we start, just a quick reminder, if you have any question during the talk, please post them in the chat, and Professor Hazelkorn will be very happy to answer your question after her talk. So without further ado, Professor Hazelkorn, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Jacob, and thanks, Lisa, for the invitation, and everyone for coming. I recognize a whole load of names of people I know, so nice to see you all virtually. So this is really looking at the system as a whole, I guess, if I was to use that term, and the kinds of actions that are going on in Ireland over the past several decades about restructuring of the system. There's a lot of issues that I know you probably want to discuss that I haven't covered, so I'm very happy to raise them, that you raise them, and that you might provoke me in good ways to rethink much of what I'm trying to think about. At the moment, this is all very helpful because, as I mentioned in here, is that the Irish government now has a policy about progressing a tertiary education system. And I am, with my colleague, advising them and writing the underlying papers and so on. So this is a bit of a new space. And so dialogue is very welcome. So I'm going to share my screen. It's a very rough overview of some of the issues over the past while. So I'm just trying to get this up. So I presume you can all see that. So as I say, this is really looking at restructuring. And I've said 2023 plus because this is likely to go on for quite a while. None of these are issues that are resolvable or I could see happening within any short period of time. So I'm going to just look at a few things about setting the context. I don't know how much you know about the Irish situation, so I'll just say something about it. Then what I've looked at is kind of phase one, the restructuring of post-secondary education, and now this move towards a tertiary system, and then some issues and challenges. Some, because there are clearly many more. So the first thing, just to set some kind of a context, I guess one of the key things to say, even since 2010, there always seems to be markers of one crisis after the next. But since the last one, not the COVID one, but the one before that, Ireland was largely a basket case and had to be rescued by the IMF. So now what we have is a very different scenario. And just looking at the country over the last 50 years, and indeed Ireland is busy celebrating its membership of the EU, 50 years of it at the moment. And that's an interesting contrast with the UK, which has exited. So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition. It's completely radically transformed from a country which was largely an exporting labor people, exporting people to all places, including Australia, as Lisa would know, and also to the United States and indeed the UK in the main, and to one that's now hugely dependent upon FDI, foreign direct investment, having highly skilled labor and skilled immigration. The country is estimated to likely have a 60 billion euro surplus in tax due to FDI over the next 5 years. So that puts the country in quite a different type of position than many others. So it was highly dependent on protectionist policies in agriculture. And now, as I said, it's one of the most open in the world and probably one of the best performing based on GDP figures, not GNP figures, across the EU. The big issues or the big story, as I would say, is massification. For a country that lacks natural resources, it has people. And the objective has been to get more and more people well educated. And that's both a plus and also one of the challenges of today. I'll come back onto that in a moment. And it's also the issue of EU membership, which came in the 1970s and has been part and parcel of this whole opening up of the economy and so on. And the realization, as I say, that the economy and the success of the society is tied up with its graduates and indeed with its higher education research. Indeed, as I said, the celebration that's going on now of the membership of the EU is all about this, and most of these actions, including the social liberalization of the society, I certainly would argue would have been very difficult to have happened had it not been for EU membership. So one of the most things that you basically see about is this massive expansion, this massification going on. The numbers of people who now have a tertiary attainment to about 63%. Now it's one of the top countries across the OECD that have the highest number of people having had. I mean, the OECD figures are all about tertiary, but it's really higher education. And it significantly outpaces the EU. 91%, as I said, complete secondary school. Very few leave without a completion. It's just a standard, you go in and you come out the other end. The enrollment, the transfer rate, matriculation into higher ed is almost 70%. About 20%, and there's no actual figures on this, but about 20% go into VET or further education and training, and then there's a population of NEETs, which is arguably disputed that it's this high. The biggest thing also is a high birth rate. It's got one of the highest birth rates and the lowest death rate. So at this stage, we've got also the population is aging fastest. So this brings in the whole issue of mature learners. And it's also given the fact that we've got this high birth rate and the number of young people in the country, 60% of that workforce of the current will be eligible workers in another 10, 15 years. So is a real question about maintaining the issue around skills. So here you see, this is just the OECD data on it, and there's Ireland, along with Korea, Ireland, and Luxembourg with the highest numbers of people with the attainment levels. And then again, just a few other kinds of background information on this. The graduate premium is still very high. So we've got about 81% of those who are in more than an upper secondary, which in terms of social cultural factors continues to make higher education the primary destination. There's no conversation about any other post-secondary really to be that operates. It's really about higher ed. And that also feeds into the whole FDI argument. There's some issues around overqualification, and I know this is a disputed term, but it is an issue that does permeate in terms, and I think that, eventually there could be issues around social and political tensions that are arising in terms of aspirations and unfulfilled. It's a society that, given all this growth, has been unable to actually provide some basic infrastructure for this growing population. We've taken in, I think, 80,000 plus in Ukrainian refugees at the moment, which is probably, given the size of the population, is quite a lot. But that's the nature of the society. Skill shortages are huge, given the growth that's going on. And at the other end, we see huge regional disparities. So I know the issue of regionalism is something that people might want to discuss. So huge regional disparities. Most of the economic activity is around Dublin, and hence it's a car-based society. So that has huge implications, and it has implications also for where graduates find their work. So just to say something, this is just in terms of some of the kind of landmarks, which I'll talk about briefly later in terms of the transformation of the landscape, in terms of a population that up until the 1960s, really there were very few people in education, certainly very obviously higher education was hugely underdeveloped, but so was secondary, which was still fee paying. So the big moves are really the formation of regional technical colleges. I'll come back onto that. Which then went through a transformation to become institutes of technology and are now redesignated largely as technological universities. We have the university system, basically a largely traditional education one, but one that is actively engaged in a lot of economic activity and so on. And then we have the further education system. Small, and overseeing it all is the Higher Education Authority, which, well, we've got two bodies, SOLIS, which manages the further education, and the Higher Education Authority, the HEA, which manages the higher education system. Notably, the private system is largely ignored. So here's what the system looks like today. There's about 8 universities, or there are 8 universities. There's 5 new technological universities. I'll explain that shortly. There's 2 institutes of technology. There's 11 other publicly funded institutions. They're largely small. Some are teacher education, College of Art, and things of this sort, music, and so on. There's also, there are private colleges that are, some of which come under the Quality Assurance Agency, some don't operate in that space, but at least about 10% of higher education students are within the private sector, fee-paying private sector, and it's for-profit private sector. The education and training boards are concerned for the further education system, and there's about 200 of these colleges spread around the country. So I'm going to look here just briefly at some of the kinds of system reshaping that has been going on from the higher education side to the, as I said, to the restructuring of the higher education landscape, to looking at the technological universities, to the reconfiguring of VET, and now the move towards a tertiary education system. So you could argue that there has been an evolution over time. You could argue that there was this, none of this was pre-planned. It's all kind of arguably random. But when you look at it in this kind of way, you think, there's kind of some planning to this, and it looks kind of coherent. So in that regard, I've called this phase 1, this reconfiguring of the post-secondary system from about 2011 to 2021. One of the first moves was, and which many countries don't have, and I think this is really quite an important development, is that in 2011 there was a national strategy. And unlike many national strategies, this one has largely been implemented. We can argue about different aspects of it, but at the macro, it's largely been implemented. It was about trying, as it says, to reconfigure the system to try and get a coherence among institutions rather than having independent institutions operating on their own. This is only higher ed. And it was the idea of a term used as directed diversity, to try and establish some role and purpose for the different institutions and working together. The other key word here is coordinated and coherent, so that rather than just individual institutions acting individually, they would operate within some kind of considered cooperation with each other and some coherence with regard to national priorities. That wasn't the whole thing that universities were to do, but certainly some alignment with the university with national priorities. And that they would participate in regional clusters. That never operated. I did try and write that. I was at the Higher Education Authority at the time and did write up numerous strategies around that, but certainly that didn't come to pass. It may reappear under the new scheme. And the last big point was really the redesignation of institutes of technology, or the potential for redesignation as technological universities. So, and I'll come back on to that. So what I think, as I said, what's quite important about this, aside from the fact that it was a national strategy, it was about the notion of diverse institutions working together, collaborating, big emphasis on widening access, a big emphasis on regional engagement, whatever that means, and a big emphasis on working together to meet national objectives. And a lot of it was also timed with the notion of expanding access and also a wider range of needs of students and communities. So in that sense, it's not dissimilar from what other countries have been trying to do. Oh, hold on, right, okay. So one component of that, so most of it was around, to some extent, you had the universities, and it confirmed all kinds of issues around institutional autonomy, the role and importance of teaching and research, and so on. But the other big part of that national strategy was about the technological universities. And the history there is the formation of what were called regional technical colleges, quite a whole system of institutions set up beginning in the 1960s to create these small-based sub-degree programs around regional colleges spread around the country. Ultimately, there were 13 of them established between 1967 and 2000. Some of them in small towns. The universities, basically, as one would expect in the large cities, these regional technical colleges in smaller regional towns. And here again, you see the EU. Without this was the European Social Fund, ESF funding, which basically underwrote the whole thing for short cycle programs. They start off working with the area around craft and professional work, and over time evolved. I worked in one of them, the largest of them, and was vice president for research. And the whole area, what developed over the decades, really, was the growth in research, the rising level of programs up from sub-degree to degree programs, and ultimately, obviously, doctoral programs and research. In 1992-07, those periods, the RTCs were redesignated as Institutes of Technology. That was just a name change. But the move then ultimately towards technological universities was a more substantive issue. And it came from a lot of the discussion you see that you will have seen obviously going on in both Australia and the UK and elsewhere. This issue of expanding the role and purpose of these institutes of technology, and also obviously their program levels and research capacity, mainly aimed at the idea that they would be kind of anchor institutions, driving research, working with SMEs, and so on. We could come back and talk about that. That will certainly be a generational change, over a generation, I'd say, but certainly that kind of move had been there. There was a lot of political support, ground dwelling for it. The notion of it was that they would be, as I said, focused primarily on science and technology, but technology meaning innovation. They run businesses big, it depends. They would run art programs, but a lot in engineering, building construction, all kinds of science programs and so on. And when the move towards the technological universities was a process, it wasn't a ministerial decision. And the process was reasonably complicated insofar as each institution had to apply, meet basic baseline criteria, then it be assessed by an international panel. The fundamental criteria is there had to be a merger of at least 2 institutions. It wasn't each one becoming a university, it was about a merger. So it was about building capacity and capability also within the region, and also arguably some issue about around efficiency. But many of these small institutions were quite small, under 2,000 students, and there were certainly issues around sustainability. So this is kinds of criteria. So in a sense, I kind of look at it in reflection of saying this is kind of Ireland's version of the California Master Plan, by trying to build in criteria by which these technological universities would operate. Now, are they going to be assessed again? No, I don't think that's ever going to happen. So there are quite heavy ambitions on it, but the functions were clearly laid out and are laid out in the legislation, and the institutions were assessed accordingly along that basis. And you could see that they were that their role is, as it says, to meet the needs of the regions, collaborating with business, enterprise, professions, and so on, involvement of stakeholders in the design and delivery, all things that they have been doing. But this was now enshrined in a way in legislation, in a way to try and keep some kind of mission distinctiveness. And so between 2019 and 2022, we had 5 mergers. I worked with 2 of them, advised them. It was quite a process, but well, we could talk about what happens in these processes and are they worth it and are they meaningful and so on. But I think at the end, it's a bit like going through a quality assurance self-assessment process and so on. There's a learning that takes place, but as I said, I think it'll be a generational change. So we've had, as I said, we've had 5 established over that period of time. 2 institutes of technology have not participated in this. It was optional. There was no, I mean, the carrot at the end was the ability to call yourself a university. So there was a carrot, and indeed the amount of money that's now being put into this pot. And here you could see how they're spread out. This is obviously the Dublin one. This one covers the Southeast, which had on paper a very high level of graduates, but basically none of them lived in the region. And was the only region without, as they would argue, without a university. Be that as it may, then we had the Southeast here, with the university here and a very small institution here in Kerry of under 2,000 students and financial difficulties. This one here over spanning from basically a hub here in Limerick, and obviously it's got about 6 campuses to another hub up here. So we've got not in an Australian case of grand geographical distances, but in an Irish case, it's everything's always relative. It's considerable a distance. And this is particularly probably the most large expanse. 3 institutions merged, quite a few campuses, no major road network and no major train network either in that region. So it's really quite an effort. And obviously you've got Northern Ireland there. So the second big move during this period has been the reorganization of FET, further education and training. Started off as through the city educational system, started off as agricultural and technical colleges, then the Vocational Education Committee, which was the educational side of the city governments, came in the 1930s and provided education largely 14 to 16-year-olds, and then expanded over the next number of decades to cover the areas with regard to vocational schools. The regional technical colleges came under the VECs, and adult education. FOSS, sorry, yeah, that should be 19, yeah, that's right, sorry. That's, so then we had the apprenticeship set up, an apprenticeship authority in the 1980s during a period of huge recession in the country with large numbers of people emigrating, again, on employment basis, until the setting up in 2013, within this phase 1 period, of a new agency to look over further education and training. The formation then The problem with it is that it really covers everything in some cases from primary to secondary, also to further education. And the FE side has probably less commitment to it. This will be a huge governance issue for it. It is a huge issue for it, but there's some attempt to begin to look at this, this part of the system. And I'm about to do a review of where that strategy is at. So as I said, 2013 was a watermark. These things take a long time to happen. So a good move, but a huge governance restructuring issue, and just a huge amount of work. The FET system is still evolving. I couldn't say that it exists strongly as a system or that it's hugely recognizable. There have been two strategies, and essentially what we've got is this triangle system between SOLAS, which looks after further education, the HEA, which looks after higher education, and then the ministry, which is called shorthand affairs. It's the Department for Further Higher Education, Research, Innovation, and Science. So it's got every name in there that's possible to have, but it is also a landmark. It's come in with this current government of bringing further and higher education together. They were all within the Department of Education. It's now a separate department. And it's also a separate, it's also, as I say, a separate department, but it's also bringing research together. So it's also bringing Science Foundation Ireland, which is the largest research funding agency, together with the Irish Research Council, and they'll be brought together. So it's an attempt to try and bring everything together. At the moment, the FET system covers everything from apprenticeships, traineeships, post-leaving certificate. It's for students who don't receive the appropriate, the high enough level at their leaving exam, and they take a couple of years post education. But it also includes things of community and adult education, core literacy, numeracy, and on the Irish NQF, the qualifications framework, it covers everything from level 1, which is basically at the bottom, to level 6, which is sub-degree. So it covers the full gamut. And because it covers all that, it's under further education. And that's the way that it's currently seen, and I suspect that's probably a realistic approach. Big question about where its focus is. A lot of it is that it is largely seen as an alternative route to higher education, and particularly for those who don't do well enough. So there's a whole social cultural snobbery around it, and which we also see reflected in the funding for its facilities and so on. A lot of attention now being given to pathways and co-delivery with designated partners. We could discuss that, which basically just re-emphasizes its role that it's an alternative route to higher ed. There are then other opportunities for unemployed, direct relevance for the labor force, but the numbers in FET have over the years begun to decline. So the next phase, which is where we are now, is the minister suddenly announced last year that he launched this policy for a unified tertiary education and research system. It's on the website. If you just look that up, he's announced that this is where we're going, and a lot of scurry of activity. And the aim listed is to create this unified, balanced, integrated knowledge and skill system, a coherent, comprehensive range of learning opportunities. The minister is clear that he sees this transcending having a separate higher education strategy or separate further education strategy. I'm not quite sure if those two systems see it this way, but certainly the minister does, and he's got another year and a half. So we'll see what happens after that. There's lots of initiatives going on, lots of activity, lots of things going on. It's just not clear that they're all going in the same direction. Big emphasis, as I said, on pathways. Certainly 14 programs have now been designated where you start in FE and finish in the higher ed. It's unclear that the higher ed will actually have the space for other people who enter from the FE side. One is a big emphasis on nursing. So big unanswered questions, but certainly that's a big focus, and also regional clusters. Nothing definitive about what these mean, but they're seen largely as institutions working with their regional clusters around sharing facilities and educational pathways. We'll see if it has any more definition over the next while. And so these are its large objectives, this idea of a more diverse and aligned learning opportunities, seamless system, so no matter who you are, whether or not you come in further education, you're a mature learner, you're a regular student, or you're a researcher, you come into one system that's coherent and understandable. Widening inclusion, widening participation access has been a big strategy for the government over the last years. There's been several strategies and policies and targets set and funding behind it. So this is to expand that. We still have a postcode lottery in terms of where students higher participation in particular constituencies. The issue about effectiveness and also looking at the role of FET within the research and innovation system. And what does that mean? And what role can they play? And how is that done? Because most of the focus, as indeed mostly everywhere when we talk about regional development and so on, is largely around research intensive universities and developing new companies and products and so on. Very little focus has generally been on skills and the importance of skills. We're also looking at flexible approaches across the system. Mature learners make up less than 12% of that is full-time students in the formal education system make up less than 12% of the student population. There's really no support for them, and there's no real recognition of them. University is very slow to get into this space. Why should they? They've got too many students knocking on their doors, and there's very little opportunity for moving in. And yet, as I showed you the data, this is going to be a big issue. And a huge issue then about balanced regional development. All of a sudden, this has become a big government strategy. So some of the issues that come up. So the big one, as I said, is massification, the numbers of people in higher education, the role that's played. Certainly the RTC IoT sector has played a significant role in expanding access. And if you look at a general mapping, if we map provision, the country is fairly well just looking at where institutions, both colleges and institutions and universities are located. They're fairly good spread. Having said that, we're still working off the kind of old models of delivery where we've got fairly strict divisions between full-time and part-time learners. Even within the new technological universities, the IoTs, they often will have a separate set for part-time learners as opposed to looking at a more porous model that looks at all learners as lifelong learners and this kind of thing. And this issue about almost 70% of students in higher ed. Is this a problem? Do we do something about that? Or it's not a problem, this is the way the economies are going. The issue of technological universities, as I mentioned, has been a response both to massification and bottom-up pressure, but the process itself has been led largely by the ministry. quite an interesting report out that, that the ministry pulled together a team of people from across all the institutions and others, chaired by a former CEO of HEFCRU, that's the funding agency in Wales, interestingly enough, to come up with this report called the TURN report, which is a TU, Technological University Research Network report, but really to set out what exactly these institutions were going to do. So you could ask, well, gosh, that seems like a bit of a strange thing to do. It was largely you would read that and think of it as a policy dump. It was also a kind of a thing which was all about laying down a range of ideas that could then be funded. It was interesting also in reflection of looking at it is that it was clear that it wasn't so obvious to the institutions what exactly they were going to be doing, or the people in them. So it's a big learning curve. But so the issue ultimately then is how these institutions are going to work. They've got a huge agenda, not least emerging. In some cases, as always, institutional differences are strong. Institutional cultures, even if they're across the road, are very strong. And even if they're the same type of institution, they all have the same staff contracts. There's no difference. They're all the same public institutions. And the criteria to which they were assessed, you could say, were arguably university criteria, the numbers having to do the kind of traditional research intensive criteria around research, numbers of PhDs and so on, and outputs. So is this a problem? So lots of issues on governance going forward. Then we have these issues that around missions and boundaries. Again, how much of an issue is this? Certainly a huge emphasis on higher ed. We're moving into the exam period, which starts in June for the Leaving Certificate, and the entire media and population will be absolutely taken over with discussing the Leaving Certificate. And as a way into higher education, the entire conversation, national conversation, is all about that. And it's all about, as you see with graduate premium, it's all about higher ed. So those raise certain issues about where does the further education system fit? How do we strengthen it? What is its role? And so on. Is it just a pathway to higher ed? Or are there other kinds of functions that it should be playing, and how? Or is it, as I said, it's seen quite loose. The boundaries between universities and TUs are becoming more and more porous. So a lot of issues here in terms of how strong should mission boundaries be. I go back and forth on some of these issues, but certainly looking at the way the system has moved, the question, as I say, is, do we care that there's 70% of our population in higher ed and only 20 in further ed? And so going on to that, so we have the further education system. And I would kind of say, all you have to do is look at the campuses or the buildings of the two groups as any person, young person or parent looking at it, and you see one of these universities with fantastic campuses and wonderful buildings, and then you see the further education system, in many cases living out of porta cabins and other kinds of facilities that are not up to scratch with a lack of actual resources. And you think, where am I going to go? And it's kind of straightforward. And as the minister has sought to deal with demand for more higher education places and has opened up potential in certain areas where there are controls, FET numbers have declined. So that's an interesting issue, and it comes back, as I say, to the same issue of what's the balance? Should there be a balance? Should we care? And the issues, the FET is trying to look at this idea of a college of the future, but it's largely an ambition that's yet to be clarified or communicated. It's not clear. Largely what they mean is just bringing together the workshops, which was more the apprenticeship type of workshops areas. It could be engineering, it could be electronics, it could be construction, could be landscaping, and so on, together with the educational side. But there are huge strategic capacity issues, huge issues around the curriculum and whether it's still, if it's relevant, because little or no work has been done in this way with the colleges. The issues of quality assurance, they now come under the same quality assurance system, and they've just now all been reviewed. The range of issues been raised. And as I say, maybe 20% of the school leaver population is realistic, and maybe it needs to prepare more for adult learners. And we also have governance issues. As I say, the system deals with everything from primary to secondary, which is where their heart is. And their directors of FET, it's not clear that they have sufficient strength, or there's just sufficient focus from the organization itself to build up the FET side. So restructuring, is it possible, or just really get on with it the way it is? So lots of issues, lots of issues. We then have the issue, which a lot of countries are looking at, this issue of middle-level skills projection, because clearly that's a huge problem in the country. We import a lot of high-level skills, but we have major skill shortages. And that has becoming a huge issue, particularly with the housing crisis that's here currently and has been for a while. There are just not enough people to work in housing, and we can't get the housing done. And so that's as I say, is a huge issue. This other one then looking at research and innovation skills, which has primarily been around research-intensive universities. You see that in all the literature, but forget the literature, you see that everywhere. It's all about that. I work on the EU smart specialization stuff, and it's all around research-intensive universities. And the startups as the counterweight to FDI, but there's insufficient focus on this issue of skills, and the role of skills in the innovation system. Here's the issue of regionalism. It's been weak. Most of the country is largely run through Dublin. There are some regional assemblies, but they have a minor role. Basically, anywhere takes you to Dublin within about 2 hours, and everything comes out of Dublin. So, and the issue around being place-based or place-responsive strategies is, as I said, it's been relatively minor and weak, and it's not clear what the universities make of it or what they understand it to mean at all. So again, another huge issue and challenge. So some ideas doing the rounds, and these are what you would call practical. What some ideas that are being discussed. This idea of a single integrated agency for tertiary education. Is it sufficient that the ministry acts as a coordinating side when we've actually got silos within the ministry? But nonetheless, that's what exists. How do we significantly strengthen the FET system? It's not just rebranding, but significant changes around a wide range of issues that we've looked at. Revamping the funding model. My general view on funding is that it begets the system. So we tend to focus predominantly on a funding system that deals with undergraduate full-time students, not mature learners, not other learners, not FET learners, and so on. And there's a funding discussion going on. somewhere in parallel, and then we have this other discussion going on about the system. I think that's fairly typical of general policy discussions. We also have a discussion going on. Another idea going around is a national mandatory credit accumulation and transfer system. Much more, it's very much of a railroad system. You get on to the course and you complete at the end. Most of our students complete within the higher ed sector, they complete. So we're looking at completion rates of 90%. You go on, you complete after 4 years and you move on. Issues around learning pathways, much more information for learners and an understanding, a guidance system, understanding what's happening. Currently, the system is very unclear. And then looking again at this issue of research and innovation ecosystems and what do we mean by that and how might that operate. So lots of discussions, as I say, doing the rounds. And that brings me to an end.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Hazelkorn. That was absolutely perfect presentation. I learned a lot, and we already have the first question in the chat. Probably, Michael Skolnick, you mind asking your question live so that we can switch into a real discussion?
If I can figure out how to do it. I've written a question, so you've seen that. But
yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
That this was a master plan, and one of the few other places besides California that really had a noteworthy master plan. Do you think that difference that I've identified is accurate, or?
Well, in fact, it's very interesting. I'm hoping you all are going to prompt me to think about these things. I think that's really interesting. I see the California Master Plan as solidifying the role of the research universities with very little attention on the community colleges. But the TU bit of it, which I guess is part of that, I refer to the Master Plan as trying to do that. It's certainly the issue around drift is really a question. Is that how much do you want them to keep in the lane? Once you start doing research and you're all under the same funding systems, you're all looking for the same money. I mean, arguably the policy in terms of distinctiveness eroded decades ago because we were all, even myself as VP research, I was looking for money under Horizon or the framework programs in Europe. We were all looking for the same money. There are differences. And so over time, are they likely to look more like each other? It depends on governance. It depends on whether or not the issues around regional commitment, development in terms of partnerships with SMEs are strengthened. But having said that, all institutions are asked to be much more flexible, to look at skills, to develop partnerships. And one of the things I expect that gets me at one point is my former institution, which has a decades of a history in construction and building and architecture and planning and so on, failed to get a bid for a new center on construction technology, and instead it went to Trinity and another university. So you ask, where is this going? You know, so boundary crossing in both directions.
Can I just follow that up though with another question that's related? And that, don't you think that it looks to me as an outsider, and you know much more about this, so I really want to get your opinion. It looks to me like the shortage of mid-level skills, that problem that you referred to, is largely a consequence of the master plan. I mean,
without a doubt, yeah.
To do that.
Yeah, well, without a doubt. Now, arguably, you see, it's not just an Irish problem, but it's magnified in the Irish case. without a doubt, though, the big push was higher ed. And it was educate, as I said, it's a country, well, you could argue now with the green economy agenda that wind and water is an energy source. But when you look at traditional forms, it bypassed the Industrial Revolution. It has none of that. So the big focus was educating. I mean, the country was hemorrhaging people and young people in the 80s and 90s. Look at the population. There's more Irish living in the US out and everywhere outside the country than in the country. So you could see exactly why the higher ed push was there, but it's always the unintended consequences of policy without thinking it through. And I expect that's the questions that I look at now when we're advising in terms of where the tertiary system is, and then there's all this other stuff going on. You're thinking, are we all running in the same direction?
So I guess the question is, to what extent the further education and training colleges can fill that vacuum?
Yeah, absolutely. And can they? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lisa Whelan raised her hand.
Thank you, Alan, for a very interesting presentation. I've got tons of questions, but I'll just ask one main one. I mean, it struck me that when you were talking that the evolution of the Irish system as you presented it seems pretty similar in some ways to England and Australia, in that in both countries you had three sectors. You had the colleges, the FE colleges in England, TAFE in Australia. You had polytechnics and things like that in England, and colleges of advanced education and so on, which in Australia, which were more vocationally focused. And then they merged with each other in both cases and became very vocationally oriented universities. And in some ways that cut the head off the potential of the colleges in both countries. It took that middle ground, you know, that vocationally oriented provision. That did not happen in Ontario. And we think that's probably one of the reasons why the colleges are so strong in Ontario. You had the basically broad liberal arts universities. You know, there are some exceptions in more recent decades, but not many really. The model is the broad-based liberal arts universities. And then the colleges were established in the 60s, and there was no middle sector. And the colleges in Ontario are really strong institutions compared to either FE in England or TAFE in Australia. So my question is, to what extent does the existence of the technological universities undermine the conditions of existence of the FE colleges? And is there any way around that in terms of governance or thinking through how the FE colleges work with those universities in particular?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. One of the this is all, I expect the issues are, this is all after the fact. So we have this situation. Now what? How do we try and what kind of proposals? One of the issues sitting there is that overlap and they being effectively eaten up by the institutes or TU system. Well, we have two different contrary moves going on in the TU system. One is exactly what we were just talking, that issue of arguably drift. The other way, I don't really like using that. I think it's quite pejorative, and we're looking at evolution of its systems. But will the technological universities decide that the sub-degree work is just too much trouble? Now, I could tell you running faculty, which had both, went everywhere from apprentices up to PhD, it's very complicated. And I know in the Australian case, you have somewhere that sub-degree is separate and so on. So I think that RMIT runs that as opposed to other. But so some of them may decide to move out of that space. But the other issue that's a problem is that level 6 for sub-degree certificates is both a qualification for the FE sector and for the HE sector.
Yeah.
And so if I'm sitting there thinking about where I'm going to go, why would I go in the FE sector? Why wouldn't I do that course and get myself, because I can go from a level 6 maybe to a level 7, which is really, it's really an entry as opposed to an exit. It's a traditional ordinary degree, and I see it having little resonance in the labor market, but certainly it gets me on a ladder. So I think there are issues and problems there. So one idea that was floating around, I mean, discussing it, was, well, maybe given the way the FET sector is, we should just incorporate it into the TU system. Now, that's not a view that I like, but certainly the governance issues of where we go are quite complex. So yeah, it's hard to see how, it's kind of, here's the system. Now, how do we rectify this in a way that isn't going to throw huge restructuring problems and costs and all that chaos up in the air? Because restructuring a system is very complicated.
So to what extent how much of the provision of the technological universities is sub-degree? And if someone does a FE diploma, are they then able to articulate to university with credit? Or does it have to be a higher ed diploma?
Yeah. So sorry to cut in. Yeah, so you might, well, first of all, it's the students doing the post-leaving certificate. They're deliberately going in to take, let's say, I did my leaving certificate. I didn't get enough points on it. I didn't do well enough. I'm going to do this course with the idea that I will do better and transfer into the HE. There's also, but a lot of that will then depend on whether or not the institution or where the university will take you. So it's, and where there are pathways, I often consider that as university capture. So what you've got is, you've got these one-to-one bilateral agreements where, yes, you can come onto our program, but this course you did isn't quite like what we would like it to be, and so on. And you've got all those issues going on. So this is where the minister has now moved forward. I mean, the department has, and we've now got 14 programs that are to be formal pathways, but they're designated pathways on designated programs at designated institutions. If I'm in one part of the country and the pathway program is the other side of the country, how is that going to work? And it's not clear that the university sector can take them all. So I think, lots of ideas, but it's not clear they're all thought through.
Thank you.
And I see Garrett asking, is there a way to, where do we go with the FE system? That's really the question. How can we build it up? How can we strengthen it? What needs to be done? Yeah, I mean, you're talking about all these issues. They're not overnight solutions. But developing something, the advantage in the Irish case, unlike, if I could say, my neighbor in England, it's not ideological. We don't tend to have ideological battles over education. There are smaller issues, but we don't tend to have this kind of one party and the next throws out that and starts off with a new idea.
Want to follow up, Gareth, with that?
Hello, Helen, and
Hi, Gareth.
good to see you. That was my second question.
Okay, sorry.
Which was, is it basically too late to remake a coherent and viable college sector where you've got 300 type institutions or organizations or what? Arguably highly localized in their purposes, their populations, and their relationships to the economy. So that relative weakness in the system is disproportionate in relation to the growth of higher education at any level. So let me push you hard. I mean, is it worth it? The second question is the other end of the system. I'm struck by what it means in Ireland to call yourself a university.
Well, the latter is about doing teaching and research. And a lot of it is name, is terminology. Certainly we had the traditional universities. They largely cover the same domains. There's not a difference in that. They're covering the same areas. The technological universities will be more focused only because they don't have the capacity to do that. But, well, I go on about research strategies, but that's a different question. But they have certain remits that they're supposed to follow. And there is within the governance system through the Higher Education Authority, a process in which the government, well, by the department sets down performance framework. Basically, these are the kinds of things we're looking for over the next 3 or 4 years. And the higher education monitors small m, monitors, and there's a dialogue, strategic dialogue between the institutions and the HEA, reporting on what you're doing. And there's gentle coaxing about, well, should you be doing this and should you be doing that? Will there be any review of these institutions in X period of time to see how well they're conforming to the legislation and what they said they'll do? I think very doubtful. Not hugely unlikely anyone is going to take a move to say, no, you haven't met these criteria with 7, because there are stretch targets in the criteria about meeting certain things 5 and 7 years down the road. That's unlikely. With regard to the FET sector, is it too late? I expect there are questions. That's why I pose a question. May we just have to accept that 20% is what we have, and look at what it is doing and the range of things it's offering. There's a lot of new apprenticeship programs, but these apprenticeship programs are equally mirroring the degree system. So, you know, it's really work-based learning. And you have many of them in the technological universities, but you have many of them. The University of Limerick is a really good example of it running a lot of really innovative work-based learning programs in the computer technology AI space. So that kind of, as you would say, border crossing runs both directions. And a lot of that is driven by policy. This is what we want. This is the kind of thing we want out of it. We want graduates who are employable, and this brings in FDI. So a lot of it is moving in that direction. I think the issue around FET is a really complicated one.
Okay.
In my heart, I think there's a role, but it won't.
Despite my question, I think there is too.
Yeah.
But my question about university threshold requirements was about the degree to which universities, let's call them the newer universities, are able to recover a purpose and mission which is outside, let's call it outside of higher education, or broader than higher education, or is that does that compromise the conditions under which they were described and approved and authorized as universities?
No, what you're referring to, whether or not their engagement role and all these kinds of things.
Yeah. I'm comparing it with the polytechnics.
Yeah.
Who had to meet requirements in relation to levels of work, and for them to become universities in the UK or in England, had to meet threshold requirements on the levels of higher education and their numbers. So yes, that binary line was very tightly drawn in the English example. And I'm wondering how tight it is in the Irish system, and is that necessarily a problem?
Well, it has been tightly drawn. It was tightly drawn. Baseline criteria as to whether or not you got past the baseline criteria that you could move into the international panel review part of the process. So it was a double-edged two-tier process, so to speak. Will they stay there? I think they will. Those kinds of things I think will be matched. The question of whether or not how well they work with regional companies, they're being imaginative and so on. I just drew up a plan from one of the local authorities who wanted in on it and came up with some ideas about sectors to develop and how they would do this. I think a lot of this, as usual, comes down to institutional leadership. Very hard to define. You see it when you see it. And the capability, not just of the president, but of the senior team. And this is, yeah, that is just a perennial issue.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know, Artie Saraswat, some of your questions probably are already answered, but just pick the ones you need.
Yeah, there is tons. Ellen, thank you so much. As ever, it was a really, really thought-provoking and informative presentation. So thanks for that. And some of the questions, rightfully, as you say, Jakob, have been picked up by Lisa. I think, I've been thinking, Ellen, as you've been speaking about the possible sort of level of competition between these technological universities and the further education sector, and thinking about the provision that's offered within the further education colleges, which might be in some kind of competition, tension, and thinking about the types of qualifications that these FE colleges can potentially offer, and thinking about the distinctiveness. So what is it that you can do at that FE college? What would be that traction? What differentiates, what distinguishes that offer within the FEC, particularly thinking about the sub-degree level? I mean, thinking about the English example, Ellen, which is not unfamiliar to you, is the low-cost sort of, low-cost offer for sub-degree provision in further education colleges, which is not the only sort of criteria which distinguishes, but for a lot of people, the localness, the low-cost nature of the offer at sub-degree level is particularly attractive and makes higher education accessible. So it's about, like, what is it? Is it about the access? Is it about the localness? Is it about, the low cost, the employer focus? What is it that would be distinctive for that sub-degree provision that would take place in an Irish further education college? Sorry, I'm just talking about a whole raft of things, perhaps all merged into one, but Jakob gave me the chance to speak, so I've offloaded all of them.
Yeah, no. Thank you very much. That's perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it is partially the low cost, though. In my view, if you really want to encourage further education, they should drop all costs. That's where I'd be putting my money. They have, in some cases, they have distinctive offerings. I mean, one of the institutions, certainly not far from where I am, has historically built up the distinctive place in animation. And I mean, and fantastic. Kind of random, because their workshop deals with everything that, that you would expect in terms of some of the building trades and so on. But yeah, they have, so there are potentials for building up distinctive offerings. But there's also a lot of crossover. It is largely on access. The reason I emphasize the fact that they arguably, as the sector does, goes from level 1, basic literacy, community development, those kinds of issues, all in numeracy, all those kinds of issues, language skills, and so on, up to entry into further ed. So it is largely about access. It's about a community-based education. I guess the question is that sufficient? Can we build, is it potential to build it up more? What's the connection with the rest of the system, as you mentioned? Yeah, it's a wide range of these kinds of issues. Are there partnering? I mean, a lot of the partnering, and then the question is whether or not that partnering between the institutions benefits both or benefits one over the other. And in benefiting one over the other, it's more likely to benefit the stronger player with the better facilities. But having said that, it depends on the fact that the further education are more widely geographically distributed.
Exactly. Elena,
Yeah.
also thinking about the two institutes of technology that you mentioned,
Yeah.
that's the main and that are part of the system. And we've been talking about the technical universities and their position. I do wonder, what is the position of those two IoTs that still exist? And where do they sit in this kind of, grand scheme of things, and their position, particularly, are they kind of seen as part of the FE sector? Are they kind of, what's again?
Yeah. Well, they're an interesting group. So the whole process was voluntary, but with a carrot, and that's arguably the carrot. So one of them is the Institute of Art, Design, and Technology, which has its own very strong remit, is part and parcel of one of the European university initiatives, the partner in film schools, this and that. It has no interest in that. I think once this merger is out of the way, these TUs are out of the way, and we've gotten over this fog afterwards. The criteria that mergers could only happen within the subsectors, i.e. the TUs could only merge with, the institutes could only merge with each other and not with the university. There will then be a move for the IADT, that Art and Design, to merge with the National College of Art and Design, both of which are in the same space, both of which have just over 1,000 students, so they're both small, both have limited capacity. I used to run the arts. I ran all the arts, and all I could say is that when you look at a map that comes down from Finland through Denmark into London, and you move then to the continent, it bypasses Ireland entirely in terms of arts and design. So there's a potential there on a national level. The other institution, and this is where leadership is there, the president ran his own show, much to his staff's disgruntlement, and he was left out of the discussions. At this stage, the other consortia have too much on their plate to take in another member. And they may be willing to do that with a lot of money to support it in a couple of years' time, I would merger to guess. But again, you could see again a loosening of the criteria, and maybe it would come in as a constituent college of a nearby university. But at the moment, it's kind of, the team, the person who played hard to get, sometimes be careful what you ask for.
Thank you very much. Lisa, you want to follow up?
Yeah, just so I was struck by what you said about 90% of people who start in the system finish. I mean, that's astonishingly high. So what's the problem that policy is trying to fix?
On the HE side, the numbers.
Yeah.
Well, I think what the main objective is to try and make sure that the system is more porous, and not porous from the sense of missions, but porous in terms of the student or the learner, being able to move around the system, have a qualification, start off in one place and move to the next. That's why I put forward the notion of a mandatory credit transfer system that allows students to develop some credit base, if you want to call it that, in one institution, and either because they hate the course they're on, something happens in life circumstances, they move or whatever, they can actually do something with it. At the moment, you can't. You start on something, you fail.
That's very interesting, because that's the thing Germanic countries developed under the framework of permeability when they introduced universities of applied science to the universities. I have another, it's not a quick question, but I was struck by your introduction to the system, also because I always thought that Ireland is more regarded as a more liberal market economy than a coordinated market economy. And when you describe the evolution of the institutions as of the 90s, I would say there is a stronger notion of trying to coordinate the system, trying to have questions of convergence of different institutions, probably of whether traditional universities and technical universities are different or not. Do you think like what you describe is sort of symptoms of a overall policy shift from a more liberal system to a stronger coordination? Or because you also said that you thought it would be great to have a single integrated agency for the whole tertiary education. Do you think that's the direction Ireland is heading to?
On the issue of whether it's a shift from a liberal to a more coordinated, I wouldn't say that there was ever anything thought about the first. It just happened. It was just haphazard. So there was no kind of system per se, or no thinking about it. Arguably, the higher education strategy in 2011 was the first time there was ever a strategy, and was the first strategy for higher education, but it was also the first strategy at all. There were varying initiatives taken, like free secondary education, the introduction of regional technical colleges, but all these were kind of, I don't want to say hit and miss, but they were all different, but there was no overarching framework. I think so that issue about, so moving from kind of just kind of ad hocery to a coordinated, coherent, directed diversity system, governed and working coordinated, where everyone's working together in the same direction, so to speak, is definitely where it has been going. There's questions of the universities might ask largely around autonomy, but it's not big issues around autonomy, I have to say. So we've got, so that's where it's going. Are we likely to see an integrated, single integrated agency? That's a big issue that takes some authority away from the ministry. So it's unclear. Second of all, they would see this as saying, oh God, don't put that idea on the table. So my colleague and I have a whole range of provocations that we call them, as opposed to do this, do that. We just call them provocations. Because it requires, governance is a whole restructuring thing. It's a lot of time and a lot of work. And you need to weigh out whether or not the benefits are worth that. And can you achieve this in a different way? That's why the question, the answer in regard to Gareth, how do we get the FET system stronger, involves issues around governance, or could it involve that? And again, you have to ask how much. So I'm a very practical, I work in policy, I'm very practical oriented in terms of what can we actually accomplish, as opposed to, wouldn't it be great if we threw it all in the air and we did this? No, what can we actually accomplish? and would actually produce the results that we think might be helpful. We're not going to do everything.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I think we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you very much, Alan Hazelkorn, for the presentation and for this extended Q&A session. This is very insightful. We, as a lookout, we have one last presentations on May 16th by Gavin Moody. He will wrap up the whole speaker series with a progress report on the social role of colleges. May 16th, you can register by our website. And thanks to Lisa and Gavin for all the input and organizations, and again to Erin Anderson, Si Young Lee, and Ahmed Su for their support. And it would be great if you could join on May 16th for the last time in this speaker series, and thank you for attending. Lisa, do you want to? Oh, sorry. Hey, Alan.
Yeah, can I just ask, is it possible to get a hold of the chat? If you can, just there's a lot of interesting comments to think about that are in there.
Absolutely, I can send it to you afterwards.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, sorry, Lisa.
No, I just wanted to say also, thank you very much, Ellen. It was really, really interesting. This comparative series has really helped us to understand the ways in which colleges are situated in so many different systems. And I really hope that coming out of this, we will be able to have a stronger basis for thinking about how we can support colleges in their various systems, understanding the national context and specificity, because there's so many lessons that we can get from the various seminars. So look, thank you again. That was really terrific. And next week's seminar, where we hope to draw some general conclusions, if there are any that can be drawn, that is. It's not so sure that I'm not so sure about that. But look, thank you again, and thank you to Ahmed, Erin, and Suyang again. And this has been a fabulous series, and I'm sure that the work will continue in the future.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.